The council chamber went silent the moment I said the words out loud. They have refused again. Every head on the floating platform turned toward me at once, dozens of eyes from a dozen different worlds, and none of them blinked. I am Cyril Adon, Senior Liaison Officer of the Galactic Concordance, and in 30 years of service, I had never seen a room full of ancient, war-hardened diplomats look so afraid of a single sentence. The humans had done it again. 3 treaties presented across 2 weeks, each one a polished, time-tested document that every other species in this chamber had signed without complaint centuries ago. And every single time, the human delegation had read every line, asked sharp, uncomfortable questions, and then folded their papers closed and said no thank you, not this one either. Councillor Hesk Voren, an elder of the Trellin Assembly, rose from his seat with the slow weight of someone who had negotiated 1,000 agreements in his long life. His voice cracked through the chamber like a whip. Explain to me, Attaché Adon, how a species with no fleet history, no border wars beyond their own single world, and no seat at this table until 11 months ago, has now rejected the Non-Aggression Compact, the Resource Allocation Framework, and the Territorial Boundary Accord. Explain how that is possible without hostile intent. I did not have an answer that would satisfy him. I had been the one sitting across from the human delegation in that small, sunlit meeting room on their world, and I remembered every second of it. Their lead negotiator, a woman named Grace Bennett, had not raised her voice once. She had simply turned page after page, tapping her finger on certain clauses and asking questions that no alien diplomat had thought to ask in longer than most species had existed. Who arbitrates disputes under this clause? She had asked, tapping the Non-Aggression Compact. And when I told her the Concordance Council does, she asked who sits on that council, and I told her the founding species hold permanent seats, and she nodded slowly and said that sounds like the same 5 families writing all the rules for everyone else. I remember the silence that followed. I remember not knowing how to respond, because she was right, and no one had ever said it plainly before. The second treaty, the Resource Allocation Framework, fell apart even faster. Her colleague, a tall, quiet man named Daniel Whitfield, had asked what happened to species who fell behind on their allocation quotas during a resource shortage. I explained that quotas were adjusted downward for the smaller signatory. He asked who decided which signatory was smaller. I told him population and fleet tonnage were the standard measures. He simply said, so the biggest players always get to keep the most, even when everyone is starving. That is not resource sharing. That is resource hoarding with better lighting. And now the third refusal, the Territorial Boundary Accord, the oldest and most sacred document in Concordance history. The one treaty every species had signed within their first standard year of contact. The humans had read it overnight and returned it the next morning, still sealed in its original folder, completely unsigned. Councillor Voren was not finished. He paced the platform, his long robes trailing behind him like a storm cloud. A species with unknown weapons capability, unknown fleet size, and now, apparently, unknown intentions, sitting outside every legal framework that keeps this galaxy from tearing itself apart. Do you understand what panic that creates, Attaché? Do you understand what our sensors cannot tell us about a species that will not be bound by anything? I understood better than anyone in that chamber, because I had spent the last 2 weeks trying to understand it myself, and the deeper I looked, the less it looked like defiance, and the more it looked like something else entirely, something older than politics, something written into the bones of an entire species. The emergency session ended without resolution, which meant, in Concordance tradition, that the matter would be escalated to full council review within the week. I left the chamber with my translator earpiece still humming and my mind circling the same question over and over. Why would a species refuse every offer of peace, every framework for stability, every treaty designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos everyone feared they might cause? I decided there was only one way to find an honest answer, and it was not going to come from another council session filled with panicked elders. It was going to come from the humans themselves. My shuttle broke atmosphere over the human capital 2 days later, sliding down through soft gray clouds, toward a city built along a wide, slow river. I had visited many worlds in my career, worlds with crystal spires and floating gardens, and cities carved from living coral, but there was something about this planet that unsettled me in a way I could not name. It was not the architecture, it was the quiet. Everywhere I looked, humans moved with a kind of watchful calm, the calm of a species that had learned to expect trouble and simply continued living anyway. Children ran through a public square near the embassy building, laughing, chasing something small and fast across the stones, and I found myself staring at them longer than I meant to, wondering how a species could raise children so freely, while also refusing every guarantee of peace offered to protect them. Grace Bennett met me at the embassy steps herself, which surprised me. Senior negotiators rarely greeted junior liaisons in person on any world I had served. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, and the kind of steady eyes that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. "Attaché Adon," she said, extending a hand in the human custom I had only recently learned to return properly. I was wondering when someone would come ask, instead of just reporting back to the council in a panic. I did not deny it. I told her plainly that the Concordance did not understand her people's decisions, and that fear was spreading fast through the chamber, and that I had come because I wanted to understand before that fear turned into something worse. She studied me for a long moment, then gestured toward the embassy doors. "Then let's talk somewhere the walls aren't listening for the council's benefit." We walked instead, along the river path, past old stone benches and trees with wide leaves that rattled softly in a breeze I could not feel through my environmental suit. She walked slower than I expected, unhurried, like she had all the time in the galaxy despite the fact that half a dozen species were currently debating whether her planet represented an existential threat. "You want to know why we won't sign," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "The council believes it means hostility, or worse, preparation for something." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a kind of tired recognition. "We spent most of our history signing things, attaché Adon, peace treaties, non-aggression pacts, trade agreements, border accords. We have thousands of years of documents just like the ones your council keeps handing us, and do you know what we learned from almost every single one of them?" I did not answer, because I sensed she did not want me to. "We learned that a treaty is only as good as the willingness of everyone at the table to actually keep it," she said. "We learned that the side writing the treaty usually writes it to protect themselves first. We learned that arbitration bodies are almost always run by whoever already holds the most power, and that smaller nations who sign first are the ones who end up trapped inside rules written by people who were never going to suffer the consequences." She stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "Your territorial boundary accord looks exactly like a document my own ancestors would have written 1,000 years ago. Elegant, reasonable sounding, and absolutely designed so that the first species to sign locks themselves into permanent disadvantage, while everyone still negotiating keeps their options open." I felt something shift in my understanding then, something I had not expected to feel. Not confirmation of hostility, not evidence of a hidden fleet or a secret weapon program, but something far more unsettling in its own way. A species that had read every clause not with suspicion of us specifically, but with the accumulated caution of an entire history of being burned by exactly this kind of promise. "So you refuse everything," I said slowly, "not because you plan to break the peace, but because you don't trust the shape of the peace being offered." Grace Bennett nodded once. "Now you're starting to understand, attaché Adon. And I think, before this is over, your council is going to have to understand it too." Behind her, the river kept moving, slow and steady, indifferent to galactic panic, indifferent to ancient councils and their trembling elders, indifferent to everything except its own patient path toward the sea. I stood there a long moment, watching the water, feeling for the first time that the true danger in this situation was not what humanity might do. It was how badly everyone else had misunderstood them from the very beginning. I returned to the Concordance station 3 days later, carrying nothing but words, and words, I quickly learned, were not enough for a council already gripped by fear. Counselor Voren listened to my report with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, and when I finished explaining what Grace Bennett had told me by the river, he simply shook his head. A history of broken promises does not excuse refusing every promise offered now, he said. If anything, attaché Adon, it makes them more dangerous. A species that trusts nothing will eventually act on nothing but its own judgment, and a species that acts only on its own judgment answers to no one. I wanted to argue that answering to no one and intending harm were not the same thing, but the chamber had already moved past me. A new proposal was being drafted, one meant to test the humans in a different way. If they would not sign a full treaty, perhaps they would accept something smaller, a limited agreement, a single narrow clause about weapons testing near shared trade routes, something so modest that refusing it would be difficult to justify to anyone. I was sent back down to the human capital with the new proposal sealed in a translation packet, and this time I was not met by Grace Bennett alone. The full human delegation had assembled in a wide conference room with tall windows overlooking the river, and among them was a woman I had not met before, introduced to me as Laura Sinclair, a legal advisor whose reputation, I would soon learn, was formidable even among her own people. The proposal is simple, I told them, laying the packet on the table between us. A temporary restriction on weapons testing within a defined radius of 3 shared trade corridors. Nothing more. It does not touch your borders, your fleet composition, or your internal governance in any way. Laura Sinclair picked up the packet without opening it and turned it over in her hands, studying the seal itself before she even read the text inside. Define temporary, she said. The standard term is 50 of your years, renewable by council vote, I said. Renewable by council vote, she repeated, setting the packet down gently. Meaning the same council that already has permanent seats reserved for the founding species decides every 50 years whether our restriction continues. Meaning we agree to something now, and the terms of extending it are decided later, by a body we still don't have a permanent voice on. I opened my mouth to explain that the human seat on the council would be established through the very treaties they kept refusing, and stopped myself, because I understood, even as the words formed, exactly how that would sound to her. You see the problem, she said quietly, watching my face. You want us to accept a restriction now in exchange for a promise of representation later, decided by the people currently deciding whether we are dangerous enough to need restricting in the first place. Daniel Whitfield, seated beside her, leaned forward. And what happens if we agree to the testing restriction, and later, once we're bound by it, the council decides we still don't qualify for a full seat? What leverage do we have then? We'll have already given up the thing we could have traded for it. I had no answer that did not sound hollow even to myself, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to understand something the council back on the station had not yet grasped. These were not people improvising resistance out of stubbornness. Every question they asked came from a place of careful, practiced foresight, as if they had already run this exact conversation 1,000 times in their own history and simply refused to let it happen again. Grace Bennett finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Attaché Adon, tell your council we appreciate the offer, and tell them plainly that we are not rejecting cooperation. We are rejecting the order of operations. Give us a real voice first, and we will gladly discuss what restrictions make sense for everyone, including ourselves. Ask us to restrict ourselves first and hope for a voice later, and you are asking us to repeat the worst mistakes of our own history, except this time on a galactic scale. I carried that message back to the station, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than fear cross Counselor Voren's face. It looked almost like respect, buried deep beneath decades of caution, though he would never have admitted it aloud. But respect did not calm the rest of the chamber. If anything, the humans' precision made things worse. A species that could dismantle a treaty clause by clause, in real time, without hesitation, was far more unsettling to the frightened elders than a species that simply said no without explanation. Silence could be dismissed as ignorance, Precision could not. Within days, factions within the Concordance began acting on their own, no longer content to wait for council consensus. I learned of it first through whispered reports from other liaison officers, then through official channels that arrived far too late to prevent what had already happened. A coalition of smaller species, led quietly by the Threll Combine, had attempted to approach the human government directly, bypassing the council entirely, offering an exclusive trade agreement in exchange for humanity's signature on a much smaller version of the original treaties. I was furious when I heard, not because the attempt itself was unusual, smaller species had tried to strike side deals before, but because of how badly it had been handled. The Threll representative, a sharp, ambitious man named Corvin Assis, according to my briefing, had approached a regional human trade office rather than the central government, hoping to secure a quiet agreement before the larger powers noticed. He had underestimated, badly, how quickly information moved among the humans themselves. By the time I arrived back on the planet to assess the damage, the regional trade office had already forwarded every detail of the Threll proposal straight to Grace Bennett's desk, along with a polite but pointed note asking why a foreign delegation was attempting to negotiate outside official channels. When I met with her again, she slid a copy of that very note across the table to me without a word. They tried to go around us, she said, and instead they handed us proof that even your own coalition doesn't fully trust the council process either. That tells us more about the state of your galaxy than any treaty ever could. I felt my composure slipping for the first time since this assignment began. This is exactly why the council is afraid, I said, more sharply than I intended. Every attempt to reach you seems to end with you learning something new about us, and us learning nothing new about you. Grace Bennett's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I saw something almost like sympathy in it. That's not entirely true, Attaché Adan. You've learned plenty about us. You've learned we ask hard questions. You've learned we don't sign under pressure or under a ticking clock. You've learned we don't panic just because a council chamber full of very old, very powerful people is panicking around us. What you haven't learned yet, she continued, is what we actually want. Because so far, nobody has asked us that question directly. Everyone has only asked us to accept what already exists. I sat with that for a long moment, and something in me, some quiet certainty I had carried since my very first day as a liaison officer, cracked open just slightly. I had spent my entire career believing the Concordance framework was simply how civilization functioned once a species reached the stars. It had never occurred to me, not once, that an entire species might look at that framework and see not order, but an old cage dressed up in polite language. Before I could respond, an alert chimed sharply on my wrist unit, a priority signal from the station itself, and my stomach tightened even before I read it. I opened the message, and the words on the screen made the room around me feel suddenly very small. A Threll Combine fleet detachment had entered the disputed Corvassa system, less than 2 days' travel from human space, citing routine border patrol. No treaty existed to define the boundaries of that system, because humanity had refused to sign the very accord that would have settled it. Grace Bennett watched my face change and did not ask what the message said. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her jacket, and looked at me with an expression that held no fear at all, only a calm, terrible readiness that I would not fully understand until much later. "It seems," she said quietly, "someone finally decided to test what happens when there's no treaty telling them not to." The council chamber erupted the moment word of the Corvassa incursion reached the station. I stood near the back of the room, still shaken from the alert, watching as elders who had spent decades speaking in measured, careful tones suddenly spoke over one another in raw, unfiltered alarm. Councillor Voren called for order 3 times before the chamber quieted enough for him to be heard. "The Threll Combine claims routine patrol," he said, reading from a data slate with visible tension in his voice. "But Corvassa borders remain undefined precisely because the humans refused the very accord that would have settled them. If conflict erupts there now, it happens in a legal vacuum, with no framework, no arbitration, and no precedent to guide any response. A precedent none of us can control, added Counselor Mareth Yal of the Vantoth Union, her voice sharp with frustration. This is exactly the danger we warned of. A species outside every agreement becomes a species other actors feel free to test, precisely because no rules exist to stop them. I felt the weight of that statement settle over me, because for the first time, I understood that the danger the Council feared was not entirely wrong, even if their diagnosis of its cause was. It was not that humanity's refusal to sign made them dangerous. It was that a lawless border, created by everyone's collective failure to build an agreement humanity could actually trust, made danger inevitable for anyone standing near it. I requested, and was granted, full access to the Concordance Historical Archive that evening, hoping to understand exactly what humanity had lived through that made them approach every offered treaty with such relentless caution. I expected to find scattered records, incomplete accounts pieced together from limited contact. Instead, I found something far more staggering. Humanity's own historical archives, shared freely and without hesitation once I asked, stretched back thousands of years, filled with treaty after treaty, empire after empire, promise after promise made and broken. I read long into the night, my quarters lit only by the pale glow of the data display, and slowly the shape of something enormous began to form in my mind. I read of ancient agreements between early human nations, alliances meant to prevent conflict, that instead became the very trigger for it once one side grew powerful enough to ignore the terms. I read of peace conferences held after devastating conflicts, where the victors wrote generous-sounding terms that, decades later, planted the seeds of the next devastating conflict. I read of smaller nations promised protection by larger ones, only to be abandoned the moment protecting them became inconvenient. But what struck me most was not the pattern of broken promises itself. Every species I had ever studied carried some version of that history. What struck me was how deliberately humanity had turned that history into instinct. Their diplomats were not improvising caution in the moment. They had spent generations training entire institutions, entire schools of thought, around a single guiding question, one I found repeated in slightly different words across 100 different documents spanning centuries. Whose interests does this document actually protect, and whose interests does it merely claim to protect? I closed the archive near dawn, my mind exhausted, and understood something I would need to carry back to the Council whether they wanted to hear it or not. Humanity had not refused every treaty because they distrusted this galaxy specifically. They refused because they had learned, at tremendous cost, to distrust the shape of persuasive language itself, regardless of who was speaking it. That understanding, however, did nothing to slow the desperation building elsewhere in the Concordance. While I studied, other factions grew impatient with the Council's inability to act, and impatience among ancient, powerful species rarely produces careful decisions. I learned of the second attempt 3 days later, this time not through whispers but through an official complaint filed directly by the human government, forwarded to my desk with a note requesting my immediate presence. I arrived to find Grace Bennett and Laura Sinclair seated across from a Concordance trade envoy I recognized only vaguely, a smooth, practiced diplomat from the Osceline Compact named Ferris Drawl, whose expression shifted from confident to visibly uncomfortable the moment I entered the room. "Attaché Adan," Laura Sinclair said, sliding a data slate toward me without preamble. "Envoy Dral here arrived this morning, offering exclusive technology sharing agreements in exchange for a limited defense pact. He described it as a gesture of goodwill between our peoples." I looked at Ferris Drawl, who straightened his collar and offered a thin smile. "A generous offer, attaché, made in good faith," he said. "Advanced propulsion schematics in exchange for a modest mutual defense understanding. Nothing that touches sovereignty." Grace Bennett did not raise her voice, but something in her tone made the temperature of the room feel colder. "Advanced propulsion schematics we already independently developed 8 months ago," she said. "Which Envoy Dral would know, if his intelligence briefings were current, which suggests either his people are behind on their own information, or they assumed we wouldn't notice the offer was worthless." I watched Ferris Drow's composure crack slightly at the edges, and I understood immediately what had happened. Someone within the Oceline Compact had assumed humanity's technological development remained roughly where it had been at first contact, and had tried to trade outdated leverage for a binding agreement before anyone realized the trade was hollow. Laura Sinclair continued without pause. And the mutual defense understanding itself commits us to responding to any threat against Oceline assets within 3 sectors, using our own fleet resources, while the Oceline Compact's reciprocal obligation is described here, on page 4, as best effort assistance where feasible. Best effort is not a defined military term in any legal system we've studied. It is a phrase designed to mean whatever the party using it decides it means, at the moment it becomes inconvenient to help. Ferris Drawl opened his mouth to respond, closed it again, and then, after a long pause, simply nodded once and gathered his materials without further argument. He left without meeting my eyes, and I understood, watching him go, that word of this failure would spread through every diplomatic circle in the Concordance within hours. I sat down heavily across from Grace Bennett once the envoy had gone, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been building in me since the archive dive the night before. "Do you ever tire of it?" I asked, reading every clause this carefully, assuming every offer hides something. She considered the question seriously before answering, which I had come to recognize as characteristic of her. "It's not that we assume every offer hides something, Attaché Adon," she said. "It's that we've learned the cost of assuming otherwise is almost always higher than the cost of checking carefully first. We would love to trust quickly. We simply haven't been given many reasons to, by anyone, including each other, throughout most of our own history." I told her then, plainly, about the fleet detachment in the Corvassa system, about the Council's fear that the lack of any treaty there had created exactly the kind of dangerous vacuum they had always warned against. I expected her to grow tense, or defensive, or perhaps even afraid. Instead, she simply nodded, as though she had been expecting this news for some time, and reached for a data slate of her own. "We're aware," she said calmly. "We've been tracking the Threll movement for 6 days now, longer than your own council's alert system apparently managed." Something in the quiet certainty of her voice unsettled me more than any panicked council session ever had. I asked her, carefully, how long humanity had known, and what, if anything, they intended to do about it. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her expression that was not caution, and was not calm patience either. It was resolve, quiet and absolute, the kind that made the whole room feel suddenly very still. "We intend to do exactly what any sovereign people would do when someone tests a border they think is undefended," she said. "We intend to show them it isn't." I did not sleep that night, and I doubt anyone on the Concordance station did either. Word of the Threll fleet's continued advance through the Corvassa system spread through every diplomatic channel within hours, and by morning, the council chamber was packed tighter than I had ever seen it, every seat filled, every observation gallery crowded with junior officials trying to catch some scrap of information before it became official. Councillor Vorin stood at the center of the chamber, his usual composure worn thin at the edges. "The Threll Combine insists this remains a routine patrol," he said, though his voice carried none of the confidence the words were meant to convey. "But 3 additional vessels joined the detachment overnight, and human colonial monitoring stations along the Corvassa approach have gone silent to outside communication." "Silent does not mean destroyed," I said quickly, before I even realized I had spoken aloud in full session, a breach of protocol for someone of my junior rank. But the chamber turned to me anyway, and I found myself continuing, because the alternative was letting fear fill the silence unchallenged. Silent means they are not broadcasting. That is not the same as being unable to. Councillor Mireth Yal fixed me with a sharp look. "And how would you know that, Attaché Adon, unless you have information the rest of this council does not?" I did have information, though not the kind she meant. I had spent the last several days learning, slowly and uncomfortably, that humanity operated on an entirely different philosophy of information sharing than every other species in this chamber. They did not broadcast strength to reassure allies, and they did not broadcast weakness to invite sympathy. They simply did what needed doing, quietly, and explained afterward, if explanation was even necessary. Before I could answer, a priority channel opened across the chamber's main display, requested, according to the header, by the human government itself. The room fell into an uneasy hush as Grace Bennett's face appeared on the screen, calm, composed, standing in what looked like a modest briefing room rather than any grand council hall. "Counselors," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "I understand there is concern regarding fleet movement near the Corvassa system. I want to address that directly, rather than let rumor fill the gap." The chamber remained silent, every elder leaning forward slightly despite themselves. 6 days ago, our monitoring stations detected the initial Threll Combine detachment entering the disputed region, she continued. "We did not raise an alarm, because no treaty defines that border, and no treaty obligates any party to inform us of routine movement through undefined space. We understood the risk that created the moment we declined to sign the Territorial Boundary Accord, and we prepared accordingly." "Prepared how?" Counselor Voren asked, and I heard, beneath the diplomatic phrasing, the same fear that had been building in that chamber for weeks. Grace Bennett's expression did not change. "We do not build our defense doctrine around treaties, Counselor Voren," she said. "We build it around the assumption that treaties may fail, may be ignored, or may simply never exist in the first place. That assumption has shaped our fleet posture since before we ever made contact with your concordance. It is not new. It is not a reaction to recent events. It is simply how we have always prepared to protect what is ours." A murmur spread through the chamber, uneasy and quick, and I understood in that moment that everyone here had made the same fundamental error I had nearly made myself. They had assumed that a species without treaties was a species without structure, without doctrine, without any coherent plan beyond stubborn refusal. It had never occurred to them that refusing every external framework might simply mean humanity had built an internal one instead, one far older and far more deeply tested than anything the Concordance had ever required of its members. 3 additional Threll vessels entered Corvassa overnight, Grace Bennett continued. "Our monitoring stations remain fully operational. They are simply not broadcasting on channels the Threll Combine can intercept, which I understand may have caused concern here. I apologize for that concern, though not for the decision itself." Counselor Voren's voice was quieter now, almost cautious. "And what is your government's intention regarding this fleet movement, Ambassador Bennett?" "Our intention," she said, "is the same as it has always been. To protect what belongs to us, without requiring anyone else's permission to do so, and without threatening anything that does not belong to us in return. We have not moved a single additional vessel toward Threll territory. We have not raised weapons toward any ship outside the disputed region. We are simply present, in strength, in the space that is ours to defend, exactly as any sovereign people would be." The transmission ended shortly after, and the chamber dissolved into overlapping conversation, dozens of voices rising at once, in a dozen different languages, translated imperfectly into a chaotic wall of sound. I stood near the edge of the platform, watching the panic I had feared for weeks finally reach its peak, except it did not look the way I had imagined it would. It did not look like fear of an aggressive, unpredictable threat. It looked like the slow, uncomfortable realization of an entire council that had spent decades assuming their framework was the only path to stability in the galaxy, now confronted with a species that had built stability entirely without them and had done so more thoroughly than anyone in that chamber had ever managed. Word reached us 6 hours later that the Threll Combine detachment had withdrawn from the Corvassa system entirely, quietly, without official statement, without the usual diplomatic notice that typically followed any military repositioning among Concordance members. I later learned, through channels far less official than the Council record, exactly what had prompted that withdrawal, and the story, once I heard it, settled into my memory with a kind of quiet, unshakable weight. A junior officer aboard the lead Threll vessel, speaking anonymously to a contact within the Ossaline trade network, described what their long-range sensors had detected once they pushed deeper into the disputed region. Human colonial monitoring stations, believed dormant or undefended given the absence of any treaty presence, had in fact been fully active the entire time, their sensor networks simply operating on frequencies and protocols the Threll fleet systems had never been designed to detect. More unsettling still, according to the same account, was what the Threll sensors eventually did register once they adjusted their scanning parameters. A human defense presence far larger, far more dispersed, and far more sophisticated than any intelligence estimate had suggested was possible for a species so recently arrived on the galactic stage. Ships positioned not in the obvious, defensive formations every Concordance fleet doctrine expected, but scattered, patient, and quiet, in a configuration the Threll officer described, according to the account I heard, as unlike anything their tactical training had prepared them to recognize. The Threll commander, faced with a picture entirely different from the one intelligence had promised, made the only reasonable decision available: withdrawal, quiet and immediate, before the situation could escalate into something no treaty existed to de-escalate. I sat with that account for a long time after I heard it, turning it over in my mind, and slowly I understood the full shape of what had actually happened over these past weeks, a shape I doubted anyone else in the Concordance chamber had fully grasped yet. Humanity had not refused every treaty out of arrogance, or recklessness, or hidden aggression, as the Council had feared from the very beginning. They had refused because they understood, with a clarity earned through thousands of years of hard experience, exactly what each document would have cost them, and exactly how little protection it would have actually offered in return. No treaty had meant no restriction, yes, but it had also meant no false confidence, no assumption of safety they had not built and verified themselves. They had chosen, deliberately and without apology, to trust their own preparation over anyone else's promises, and when tested, that preparation had held. I returned to the council chamber the following morning to deliver my final report on the matter, and for the first time since this assignment began, I found myself uncertain not of what had happened, but of what it meant for everything the Concordance believed about itself. A framework built over centuries, designed to bring order and stability to hundreds of species across the galaxy, had just been quietly outmatched by a single species who had simply refused to need it in the first place. Counselor Vorin met my eyes as I entered, and for the first time in our long acquaintance, I saw something in his expression that looked less like fear and more like the beginning of a very old, very powerful institution realizing it might finally need to change. The weeks following the Corvassa withdrawal changed the Concordance in ways I do not think anyone, human or otherwise, fully anticipated. I had expected anger from the Council once the full shape of events became clear, a demand for accountability, perhaps even calls for sanctions against a species that had embarrassed the Threll Combine so thoroughly on the galactic stage. Instead, what I witnessed was something far more interesting and far more difficult for an institution as old as the Concordance to accept. I watched an entire body of ancient, powerful diplomats begin, slowly and with visible discomfort, to question the very foundation of how they had always done things. Counselor Vorin called for a special session 10 days after the withdrawal, and this time, when I entered the chamber, I noticed something different immediately. The usual seating arrangement, founding species along the inner ring, newer members pushed toward the outer edges, had been quietly rearranged. It was a small change, easy to miss if you were not looking for it, but I had spent enough time studying human negotiation to recognize the significance of a symbolic gesture made before a single word had even been spoken. "We have spent this session reviewing the events of the past month," Counselor Vorin began, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks, though still carrying the weight of an admission he clearly found difficult to make. "And I believe, after much consideration, that this council has made an error in how it approached the human delegation from the very beginning." A murmur passed through the chamber, though quieter and more measured than the panic I remembered from previous sessions. Counselor Mireth Yal, who had been among the sharpest critics of humanity throughout this entire ordeal, rose slowly from her seat. An error in offering them the same frameworks every other species accepted upon joining this concordance, she said, though her tone carried less certainty than it once had. An error in assuming those frameworks were universal simply because they had gone unchallenged for so long, Counselor Voren replied. We built this concordance on the belief that shared rules, applied equally, create stability. And in most cases, across most of our long history, that belief has served us well. But the humans have shown us something we perhaps should have recognized sooner. A framework applied equally is not the same as a framework negotiated fairly, particularly when it was written, clause by clause, before certain voices were ever present at the table to shape it. I watched Counselor Mareth Yal consider this in silence for a long moment, before finally, slowly, she nodded, and something in that small gesture told me more about the shifting temperature of this council than any formal vote could have. The proposal that followed, drafted over the following weeks with input I was surprised and honored to be asked to provide, departed from every precedent the concordance had followed since its founding. Rather than presenting humanity with another version of the same standard treaties, reworded and softened, the Council instead proposed something entirely new. Individual negotiation, species by species, agreement by agreement, built around specific mutual interests rather than universal, one-size framework designed to bind every signatory the same way, regardless of their actual circumstances. I was assigned, at Grace Bennett's specific request, to help coordinate the first of these individualized discussions, and I found myself, for the first time since arriving on this assignment, genuinely looking forward to the work ahead, rather than dreading another round of refusals. The first agreement reached was modest by any measure, a narrow, carefully worded understanding between humanity and the Osceline Compact regarding shared use of a single trade corridor, with clearly defined arbitration handled jointly by representatives from both parties rather than a distant council panel. It took 11 days of careful discussion to finalize, considerably longer than the standard treaties had ever required, but when Laura Sinclair finally signed her name to the document, she did so without a single moment of hesitation, and I understood why immediately upon reading the final text. Every clause had been shaped by both parties equally. Every obligation ran in both directions, clearly and specifically defined, with no ambiguous language left to be interpreted later by whoever held the most power when a dispute eventually arose. Word of that agreement spread quickly through the concordance, and within a month, 3 additional species had approached humanity independently, seeking similarly tailored arrangements rather than waiting for the Council to dictate universal terms on their behalf. I watched, with something approaching wonder, as an institution built on centuries of uniform procedure slowly began learning to negotiate the way humanity always had, one relationship at a time, built on specific trust rather than assumed obligation. Not everyone adapted easily. Counselor Mareth Yal remained cautious throughout the transition, and I do not believe she ever fully abandoned her early fear of a species so thoroughly unbound by tradition. But even she, during one of our final formal sessions together, admitted something to me privately that I have carried with me ever since. I still do not know if I trust them completely, Attaché Adon, she said, standing beside me near the chamber's tall observation window, watching the slow turn of stars beyond the station's hull. But I trust their reasoning, and in a galaxy this old, filled with institutions this set in their ways, perhaps that is a rarer thing than trust itself. I thought often, during those weeks, about my very first conversation with Grace Bennett beside the quiet river near the human embassy, about the calm, unhurried way she had explained centuries of broken promises without a trace of bitterness in her voice, only clear, hard-earned caution. I understood now what I had not fully grasped then, that humanity's refusal had never truly been about this concordance specifically, and had never been rooted in any hidden hostility waiting to reveal itself. It had been rooted in something far more universal, a species that had learned, through immense and repeated cost, that peace built on unexamined trust was no peace at all, only a fragile pause before the next inevitable collapse. I requested a final meeting with Grace Bennett before my reassignment back to full council duty was finalized, and she agreed readily, meeting me once again along the same river path where our first real conversation had taken place months earlier. The trees had changed since then, their wide leaves now edged with the deep gold of the changing season, and the water moved with the same slow, patient certainty I remembered from my very first visit. "You changed something in that chamber," I told her, as we walked. Something I don't think anyone expected to be possible when this whole situation began. Grace Bennett considered that for a long moment before answering, her eyes on the water rather than on me. "We didn't change anything, Attaché Adon," she said finally. "We just refused to pretend the old way was working as well as everyone claimed it was. Sometimes that's enough to make an entire system look at itself honestly for the first time in a long while." I asked her then, because I had wondered it for weeks and had never found the right moment before, whether she believed the Concordance would ever fully become what humanity clearly believed it should be, an institution built on individually earned trust rather than uniformly imposed obligation. She smiled slightly at that, the first time I had seen her do so since we met. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Old institutions change slowly, and this one is older than almost anything my people have ever built. But I think it's already different than it was 3 months ago, and I think that difference came from something simple. We asked questions nobody else had bothered asking in a very long time, and instead of punishing us for asking them, this council eventually chose to listen." We walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, and I found myself thinking not of the panic that had gripped the council chamber during those first tense weeks, nor of the fleet tensions that had nearly spiraled into something far more dangerous over Corvassa, but of something quieter, and in its own way, far more significant. An entire galactic institution, built on centuries of assumed wisdom, had been forced to confront the possibility that uniform rules, however elegant and however long established, were not the same thing as fairness, and that true stability might require far more patience, far more individual attention, and far more humility than any single, universal framework could ever provide. Humanity had not entered this galaxy seeking conflict, nor had they entered seeking to dismantle an institution that had, in its own imperfect way, kept relative peace among hundreds of species for centuries. They had simply entered carrying the hard-earned wisdom of their own long and difficult history, unwilling to set that wisdom aside simply because everyone else around the table had grown comfortable with the way things had always been done. As my shuttle lifted away from the human capital for what I believed, at the time, would be my final visit in an official capacity, I looked back down at that wide, slow river one last time, and I thought about how strange it was that panic, real and consuming as it had felt within that council chamber, had ultimately led not to conflict, but to something far more valuable and far more difficult to build. A galaxy slowly learning, one careful, individually negotiated relationship at a time, that respect earned through patience and honesty would always outlast obligation demanded through fear. The council chamber I returned to felt different in ways I could not have described before this assignment began. Quieter, perhaps, more careful in its language, more willing, in small but noticeable ways, to ask the same hard questions humanity had once asked of us, rather than simply assuming its own long-standing answers remained correct, simply because they always had been. I do not know what the galaxy will look like 100 years from now, whether the Concordance will have transformed fully into the kind of institution humanity's careful example suggested was possible, or whether old habits, comfortable and deeply rooted, will eventually reassert themselves once the memory of this crisis fades. But I know what I witnessed during those tense, uncertain months, and I know that a single species, refusing every easy promise offered to them, had done something no fleet, no weapon, and no show of force had ever managed within this Concordance's long history. They had made an ancient galaxy stop, look honestly at itself for the first time in longer than most of its members could remember, and finally ask whether the peace it had always claimed to protect was truly worth protecting in the form it had always taken, or whether it was time, at last, to build something better.